In this video, we're going to be covering Lauren Chen, who's a YouTuber. She's got a large following. I believe she's right-wing leaning. At the very least, she says that she espouses Christian views. She talks about that in this video. Even though, in my opinion, most people in the Western world are socialists, and most people don't even know that they're socialists. But in this video, she's talking about why men don't approach, and we're going to cover that now.
Apparently, we have learned that almost 1 in 2 young men are not approaching women. Well, that begs the question of why? Why is that? And if you're someone from the red pill community or who has inclinations toward that type of thinking, your response is probably going to be, well, because it just doesn't make sense for a man to try that. There are all these legal ramifications for things like divorce, or heck, even things like Me Too, where, a allegation could ruin someone's life regardless of how flimsy it is. So yeah, maybe men aren't approaching women anymore because they just don't think it's worth it because society is increasingly anti-male. And don't get me wrong.
And I would say, just off the bat, the premise for the context of the discussion is why men aren't approaching women. And approaching women is actually new. Men in the past, you look back in the early 1900s, men were not going out and approaching women like that. Meet a single woman on the street and kick game to her. That is something that is new in the dating culture of today's world. And so you really can't look too far back in time to see a time period where men pursued women like that, where men were constantly approaching women. If anything, it was quite the opposite. You had, family members, mothers, fathers, friends, etc., who were like, hey, let me introduce you to so-and-so, right? Typically, when people got together, they got together with individuals within their social circle, whether that's from church. Overwhelmingly, most of these people lived in the same neighborhood. So there was no approaching women like you see in today's hookup culture that is a result of, women, in essence, pricing themselves out of the market when it comes to being housewives. And that's, something that is related to socialism.
Even though I don't subscribe to the red pill view of the world or consider myself part of that community because I think it's frankly anti-Christian and anti-family at its core, I do agree.
And I would say that that is pretty much true what she talks about the red pill. The chief tenets, which is, no cohabitation, not having children, and not getting married. And all those three tenets are in agreement with the lack of children, pushing women into the workforce, not being able to afford women to go back into the workforce because of socialism. But a lot of what is not discussed is more important, which is the financial system that we live under and the global economic system in which we live under. And so a lot of people don't take that into consideration. They take things, like red pill theory. And that is actually, in my opinion, it feels like it's something that was pushed by the government to get men not to interact with women as much, because they couldn't afford for these women to come out of the workplace. They needed these women to come into the workplace to help push back against the inflation.
That society is very gynocentric currently, and men have a...
And I would say society is definitely not gynocentric. I think that's something that is pushed by the red pill community. When you look at society, there is no society that existed or has ever existed that is gynocentric. At the end of the day, men control access to relationships, men control access to sex. The vast majority of money is made by men, and men decide what is culture, and women adapt to that culture.
A lot to lose if they try to hook up with or even marry the wrong woman. But according to the data, and here we have something else that's pretty shocking, no, those reasons do not top the list of why men are not approaching women. You see, here we have another graph that breaks down the data. And while we can see that around 25% of those who describe themselves as black pill, yes, do not approach.
I have no idea where any of this information comes from. Like, this chart seems kind of ridiculous. I'm not sure who they're polling. It doesn't really talk about it, and she doesn't really cover it. So I'm going to go ahead and skip this portion of the video.
social consequences for approaching a woman could include things like, being labeled creepy or even a harasser. So, I mean, that's fair enough. That's definitely a realm where we can talk about how the Me Too movement may have been overzealous in its execution. But still, what's really interesting is that the number one reason for both all men and even black-pilled men for not approaching a woman is fear of rejection. What's crazy is that it seems the black-pilled men are even more likely to say they don't approach women because of a fear of rejection than men in general. Now, like I said, dating is scary and dating is hard. Nobody likes to be rejected, but at the same time, sometimes you just gotta shoot your shot. No, rejection isn't fun, but it's also ultimately not the end of the world. And I feel like a fear of rejection is stopping so many men from approaching women because men and women no longer hang out together as frequently as they used to. I mean, think about it. Due to things like COVID and just remote learning, even aside from that becoming more and more popular, I feel like those who are between the ages of 18 to 25 have way less experience socializing with the opposite sex in just a casual environment like high school or college classes than people who are my age. And on top of that,
I would say that's not the case. People still spend plenty of time doing various groups. If anything, you see the opposite. You see where women are always invading male spaces, right? Just look at the Boy Scouts. Look at sports in general, right? Women tend to invade spaces where the men are. It's not the other way around. And this is where a lot of people who follow this sort of a mindset just don't understand. It isn't the men who are chasing the women. Women are always chasing men. And so this video, and I think Rollo did a video talking about this, it takes the relationship, the dynamic of relationships. Men don't chase women. Even though even in this video, she had talked about this. She makes a comment, I believe later on, that we believe that men are the type to chase. That is a social construct. That is what you see in like Disney movies, right? You see like, what was that movie? I forgot what that white dude, and he had like a big nose. He was a fireman. I think it was called Roxanne. And he was chasing this, pretty blonde girl, and he was giving her flowers, like your typical like simp video. But that's not reality. That's not how reality works. Overwhelmingly, women pursue. And this is why under Red Pill they say men control access to relationships. And you'll see various groups that talk about, well, the woman sleeps with the man and then it's the woman's job to give the man a reason to stay. That is an entirely new social dynamic that did not exist prior to today's dating culture. And so you see a lot of these people that cover this sort of information. They're looking at things from the standpoint of today and not like the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years of how relationships have always worked, which is women require men, not the other way around. And so women tend to put themselves into positions where they will be seen by men. This is why when the dating culture was killed in bars, because they started making rules that if you were hooking up with a woman who was intoxicated, then the male could be liable for rape. And so what happened, right? In the New York bar scene, you started to see a lot less men that were going to the bars. So what you started to see more of the younger men going into places like the gym. And then not too long after that, you started seeing young women doing TikTok videos about this man's watching me, etc. Because overwhelmingly they wanted male attention, but they weren't getting male attention. So they literally had to go to these lengths to try to get men to pay attention to them. Because the old adage was true. And it still is true today, where many mothers and fathers would tell their young daughters about not being promiscuous, because they would say things like, why would he buy the cow if you're giving the milk away for free? And so many young men understand this dynamic today. And while, yes, there are a subset of men who perhaps don't have access to sex, but today, by and large, it is very easy for a man to have access to sex. Either you can go out there and pay for it, or the women are just literally throwing it at you because women can't find men to have relationships with. And so when you start to see a large subset of men who are not taking interest in the women, more than likely it's a fault on the men who are just perhaps not interested, which she never covers in this video. So she never covers the fact that maybe the men just aren't interested in you. But this is their mindset. This is the mindset of those and people like this that believe in gynocentrism. There is no society that exists that is gynocentric. Every society that has ever existed and will continue to exist will always be centered around men. Now, yes, they might tell you that because this happens, it's gynocentric. But overwhelmingly, especially when you look to things like the family court and where the family court sprung from, it sprung from men's mistreatment. The whole, what's it called? The no-fault divorce was actually instituted by men. Men instituted no-fault divorce. It was not instituted by women. Men instituted no-fault divorce because they wanted to divorce their wives. And so back then, people had to prove infidelity to get divorced. And so they instituted a no-fault divorce. Later on, it ended up getting co-opted by women when they were able to use this as an opportunity to basically steal from men. But overwhelmingly, the case today is that women are just very easy and men have changed. Men are not pursuing women for relationships. They're pursuing women for sex. This is why when women would say, I'm on, Tinder, or I'm on Plenty of Fish, and they were like, well, I'm not looking for a hookup, I'm looking for a relationship. And of course, whenever you would listen to Red Pillars, they would always say, well, that's dumb of you because this is a hookup site. Well, who made it a hookup site? It's not the women. The women were on there looking for relationships. The men were on there looking to hook up. And this is the problem. It's men who have changed, not women. And so it's men who don't want relationships because in our society and in many socialist societies, you end up with a very low birth rate because there's no over-ending arc. There's no reason for men to have to take care of women because under socialism, the government can do it. And so that's why when you looked into socialist societies all the way back into the 1800s, this is what you saw. You saw overwhelmingly low birth rates. And this is why they ended up importing and immigrating, tens of thousands of migrants. And there was another video that I wanted to talk about in relation to why so many men nowadays are interested in video games. And Yuval Harari talks about this in his video. We're going to cut it really quick. And of course, he's talking about how as society had changed throughout what he refers to as socialist Europe, they have a bunch of what they refer to as useless individuals within society.
Or very few countries that underwent the revolution fast enough to subjugate everybody else. What we're talking about now is like a second industrial revolution.
So what he's talking about, the industrial revolution of the mid 1800s going into the 1900s. And so when you look back at that time period where people who had industrialized, as he had stated in this video, that they ended up subjugating people, right? We're going to listen to that clip one more time.
Fast enough to subjugate everybody else.
Right? So it's just basically Age of Empires and what was happening at this time period. And it's relevant. It's relevant to our time period because if you don't understand history, you don't understand how we got to the situation. Because it's like reading a long novel. If you start a novel from the middle of a story, you're going to be confused and not understand who these characters are and why they play such a role. And so when you understand what was going on in the pre-World War I era, the Civil War in America and the wars that went on in mid-1800 Europe was overwhelmingly about socialism. And so as they industrialized through slavery, right, because slavery existed at this time, they were then able to advance beyond other societies and, as he had said, subjugate people.
For very few countries that underwent the revolution fast enough to subjugate everybody else. What we're talking about now is like a second industrial revolution, but the product this time will not be textiles or machines or vehicles or even weapons. The product this time will be humans themselves. we are basically learning to produce bodies and minds. Bodies and minds are going to be, I think, the two main products of the next wave of all.
No, I think he's talking about cloning or the adaptation. Like if I've read his book, and I've read Klaus Schwab's book, and these people believe in the merging of technology with the human body. And they believe in, we're going to put chips in your brain. This is what Elon Musk overwhelmingly talks about, right? With his, what is it called? I forget the spinal cord technology that he was working on. But overwhelmingly, this is what these people push. This is like, if you read like the World Economic Forum's, the agenda for 2030, this is what they talk about, the merging of man with machine, and we're going to be immortal and all this crazy shit.
But ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, the future is already here. The future has begun. It's a new system. It changes us because it's a fusion of our physical, digital, and biological spheres. It's an integration of those spheres. Just think of sensors planted into our brains. The opportunities are immense, and we have to prepare ourselves.
And the problem is, in the society in which they believe that society is going to go, is that what are you going to do with all these people, right? Because as we become more technologically advanced, you don't have to have all these people in the workforce.
All these changes. And if there is a gap between those that know to produce bodies and minds and those that do not, then this is far greater than anything we saw before in history. And this time, if you're not part of the revolution fast enough, then you probably become extinct.
And so either that, or he could be talking about the merging of AI, artificial intelligence, with robotics, right? And this is what he's saying, that this is the new race, right? The new race for who will subjugate who, because that was the original premise, and that's it. And when you look at history, this is exactly what happened through socialism.
Once you know how to produce bodies and brains and minds, so cheap labor in Africa or South Asia or wherever, it simply counts for nothing. Again, I think that the biggest question.
And that's what exists today. This is why you see a lot of countries in Africa for cheap labor, minerals, etc. This is why you see them also in places like in Mexico and in many other countries, where they can drive the people down into poverty, extract their resources, and then give them paper currency, or now they just give them digital currency.
Maybe in economics and politics of the coming decades will be what to do with all these useless people. I don't think we have an economic model for that. My best guess, which is just a guess, is that food will not be a problem. With that kind of technology, you will be able to produce food to feed everybody. The problem is more boredom, and what to do with them, and how will they find some sense of meaning in life when they are basically meaningless, worthless. My best guess at present is a combination of drugs and computer games.
Narrow one-way street in San Francisco is causing major problems for homeowners and businesses. They say years of complaints over drug dealing, public defecation, and substance use are falling on deaf ears. The trouble spot is Willow Street near Van Ness Avenue. ABC 7 News anchor Dion Lim hit the streets in the neighborhood and shows us what city leaders say are hurdles to solving the problem, along with proposed solutions.
It's hard to believe, driving through the areas of Van Ness Avenue and Willow Streets, we're just blocks from City Hall.
It has been very, very frustrating that we have to, as a resident, have to witness this chaos every single day.
Tent after tent, open drug dealing, drug use, and a whole host of other safety issues.
There's a man throwing knives in front of our door.
Are what residents of one condo complex say they've been dealing with for years.
And this is basically what you see being pushed today. This is what you see in many Western countries, what they refer to as the decriminalization of drugs. And of course, video gaming is a very popular drug to keep the mind of the common man basically is bread and circus, right? It's just bread and circus. How do we keep the people calm so that they don't turn on us? And this is something that I don't think anybody in the red pill space covers. Overwhelmingly, the problem that we have where men and women don't interact, it's because of socialism. And it's entirely because the government takes on the role of the provider through socialism, through the monetary system in which they're able to steal money away from the men that exist within that country, but also within men globally. They're globally able to drive many people into poverty, and the result in overwhelmingly, I think there was an article that I was just reading. I'm not going to touch on it in this video, but overwhelmingly there was an excerpt from an article that I had read here called it was called Population Policies in Socialist Countries of Europe. And this is basically a writing from like the mid 1800s, covering the mid 1800s all the way up into the 1900s. And overwhelmingly what the data showed was that all socialist countries had no net birth rate. And so what happened was that it resulted in most of these countries, even at this early of a time period, being forced into immigrating people into their country. And that's the nature of the game, because you eventually run out of other people's money. And so this is one of the reasons, this is one of the overarching, most important reasons about why you see men not approaching women nowadays, overwhelmingly because they don't need them in the current system, because everything that you need from a woman, she just gives to you. She just throws it at you. And so men don't feel the need to be or desirous of to be responsible for women. And so they've abdicated that decision and that authority to their governments. And that's why you don't see men approaching women.